Hi there, my name is Brian Nicol, and this will be my video presentation for Module 4.2 for ARC602. The first slide we start out with is a montage of the building that I'm going to be proposing with some material shots, some schematic diagrams, and some little renderings about what the building's about that we're going to get into later. The first thing we get into is research and mapping integration. The first thing I did was print out a base map and hand draw some layers onto it that looks at site access, vehicle circulation, pedestrian circulation, green areas, building heights, anything that might have to do with the site and would impact the building. And we look at the research of the site, like looking at what kind of employment is around the area, what kind of zoning, how vacancy rates affect New York City, and the homelessness in New York City, which are all factors of this site and project. We also look at the environmental strategy. The big thing in this is the risk of flooding, as well as the high surface temperatures in the city with so much hardscape concrete and not a lot of tree canopies. We also begin by looking at the site as it exists. These three shots kind of look at some aerial views of the site in a hand-drawn manner, to show how the site sits and sort of the context it's in with all these high buildings surrounding it. We also look at the precedent studies to begin our project to see what kind of buildings relate to our proposed building and what we can take from these precedents, like the green envelope in the Oasia Hotel downtown in Singapore. The stormwater recycling system is one of the things that we took from One Central Park in Sydney. And then the Mata Terrace had a really good floodwater collection and reuse as it sat in a flood risk zone as well. Next, we take a look at the urban integration, and we created some of these diagrams about who's going to be using the site in the areas and how these different levels are going to act as a public versus private zone. The ground level is going to be used mostly for public. Where we get into the mid-levels, it'll be mixed, and then the higher you go is going to be more privacy for the long-term residents. Then we get into actually creating the building and what sort of massing is going to sit on the site, and we go through this by creating different iterations by looking at some plan views, 3D views, elevations, and how it would ultimately sit on the site and what ends up working best. Once we have that and settled on it, there are some schematic diagrams of how these relationships are going to work with the building, like the circulation through and the public versus private diagram. Then once we have our massing and everything, we set it on the site itself and create a pretty fleshed out site plan. We look at the servicing coming in, the size of the building, everything around it, including streetlights, maintenance holes, bus stops, and the zoning for all the adjacent properties. Next, we get into the program of the building itself. This pie chart shows how the building is broken down, with 54% being residential, public interface being 13%, 14% into the semi-public space, and then 1% into service and 18% in circulation. And there's just a little screenshot of a typical bedroom in this building. Keeping on the program, we look at the first three floors that are mainly into the public space and getting into the private once you get into the third floor, like the office spaces and the gym. But at the first and second floor, it's the threshold to the interior and exterior. There's places like retail space, food options, and grocery stores. And once you get above the third floor into the residential areas, the fourth floor to the 13th floor are all going to be residential units, the smaller units starting at the bottom. And then once you work your way up, you're getting into larger units with amenity spaces on the same floor. And then also there's the terraces as well. The next item we look at is the structural system and the building envelope. This is sort of a typical 3D shot of how the building is going to be built, with the foundations and the piers, with the steel columns going on top of the concrete piers, steel beams with open web steel joists, and then a steel deck with concrete top to create the basic structure of the building. Another snapshot here is our building and its skeleton with these foundation walls, these steel and concrete columns, and how the columns and beams, floors and columns all sort of work together. Next, we take a look at the building envelopes for the typical construction. The typical roof on the left is a roof membrane with fiberboard insulation, concrete, vapor barrier, steel deck, and open web steel joists. And the typical wall being an ACM panel with the normal air barrier, the rigid insulation with steel girts, dense glass, steel stud construction, vapor barrier, and gypsum wall board. We then continue on with our environmental strategy, looking first at the building envelope and the performance and what it should be at with minimum insulation, what kind of systems we should look at between the aluminum panel wall and the curtain wall system, what kind of goals we're looking at. Some of the items we're looking at, like using the cladding system as a sustainable solution, using light cladding over dark cladding to reflect sunlight instead of absorbing it, and then using operable windows for summer passive cooling. Furthermore, we're looking at other environmental strategies, like using the balcony for the terraces as a heat management system by using the green to absorb some of the sunlight, and then as well use it as a stormwater retention area for fire protection and stormwater reuse. Then looking at a few more typical systems like the green roof system and how that works together from the top to down all the way down to the structure and the concrete. We also look at a detail of the typical curtain wall system as we use quite a bit of it on this building, and how the HVAC system is going to service all the rooms while being mainly located in the basement. Then we look at the representation and visualization of the building. We started a nice aerial view of the terrace space and the green balconies where people are going to be using these spaces as a gathering point for the private residences. Another shot here, which also lets you see the roof with the greenhouse on top. And finally, a third one where the first three floors are the public spaces with the curtain wall, where we then move into the residential spaces above. Next, we take a look at the street views of the building. As you approach the building and the threshold from exterior to interior, you're sort of met with these large, rigid, strong columns that pay homage to the industrial zoning surrounding the building, and ties back to a bit of the history of the building. It also sits a little bit high. This helps with the risk with the flood zone. Then we get into some interior renders. We have what the hallway might look like when you're coming out of the elevator and looking towards the green balcony. We've got a shot of the green roof, another one looking at the large fourth floor terrace, what you might see on the ground floor in the retail space, and how you might be looking at the building if you're looking at it from the High Line across the street. The next slide we look at are more renderings, mostly in the public area of the building. We have some circulation space at the lobby and the second floor space. We have a look at the grocery store right at the threshold of the building. We have a look at the gym that's on the third floor and the mailroom on the first floor for long-term residents. Finally, we take a look at some of the renderings from the private spaces, like the social gathering space on the 13th floor, as well as a couple snapshots of the kitchen and dining room of some typical units. Again, similar to the threshold of the building, there's a lot of concrete finishes to sort of pay homage to the the industrial zoning of this neighborhood. And we also have a little bit of a sleeker interior look to give it that modern feel. Thank you very much for taking the time to look at this presentation.